Social networks are dangerous, and Elon Musk is a fascist who relays far-right rhetoric, according to a leader who acts as if he has a large majority and calls his dissenters factious, even though he won only about a third of the vote in the elections last month. Is this leader Maduro or Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister? That's the problem. The statement I've just made doesn't make it clear. British democracy is decidedly sick. Good evening, I'm Philippe Fabry. It's August 11th, 2024, 9:40 p.m. I was unsure about tonight's topic due to the abundance of news related to my recent discussions. While I may briefly mention Bangladesh and the Middle East, I believe it is imperative to focus on the United Kingdom as it provides insight into our future, which says a lot about the state of progress, evolution, and possible evolution of Western society. Is the United Kingdom, which is the oldest democracy in terms of the age of European civilization in particular, quite simply, give us a glimpse of our future destiny? Are we too destined to go down this road? So, there are obviously a lot of things in what's happening politically in the UK that echoes much of what's happening in the Western world, but the crisis that has erupted over the last few days, and in particular the enormous media political machine that has been set in motion to explain to people that they practically couldn't see what they were seeing, particularly on social networks, or that they didn't understand what they were understanding, and that those of them who believed a certain number of things were being purely manipulated. This machine is a real steamroller, and above all, it's backed up by a judicial system that, in terms of the sentences it hands down, is clearly out of all proportion to what we see in France for similar behavior. When you see people who, for taking part in demonstrations, gesticulating in front of police officers, even jostling and trying to cross a cordon sanitaire, get dozens of months in prison, whereas in France, to get 4 or 5 months in prison, you basically need to have shot fireworks at a police station. You can see that there's a big difference. So maybe some people will complain that French justice is more lax than British justice, but I don't think they're the ones who usually complain that justice is lax. In other words, it's always worth putting things into perspective from that point of view. But what I'd like to do is, as usual, give you a bit of a straightforward analysis of what's going on in the UK. And then, as a second step, we'll do a little historionomic exercise to see if historionomics gives us any food for thought and points us in the direction of certain conclusions or not. Towards certain conclusions or not. We'll start with a simple analysis of what's going on. As you know, riots broke out in England following the murder of 3 young girls. At first, there were rumors that it's the same thing in France. It's the famous same old reflex. So when there's a knife attack, we immediately imagine the profile that generally applies because it's a classic human inference system. When in 90% of cases it's that, you assume that it's that. So here we're usually talking about the famous OQTF. There's no OQTF. Strictly speaking, it must have a different name in the UK, but we'll say it's the broader category of migrants. So immediately there was the idea that it was a migrant who had attacked these girls with a knife, and therefore probably also a Muslim migrant, which is why the popular reflex of demonstrations and protests was so strong. The popular reflex of demonstrations and riots, because there were riots, unjustifiably attacked the mosques of people who couldn't stand it and were therefore attacked. This, of course, in turn led to violent demonstrations by Muslims with an Islamist bent, resulting in a conflagration and escalation that the authorities are trying to block. The problem, of course, is that this affair in Great Britain, as in much of Europe and Western Europe and France in particular, follows a series of incidents over the years, acts of terrorism, etc., which generally come from the same sections of the population, i.e. people of immigrant origin and often of Muslim faith, because there is regularly a porosity between terrorism and acts, the famous acts of the unbalanced. Since unbalanced people who come from a certain culture tend to commit violent acts in the name of that culture, quite simply. So there is indeed this weariness that is appearing in the British population. And of course, the British authorities are extremely worried about the situation, as I was saying on Twitter the other day, because you have to realize that the major difference between France and the UK is that the UK doesn't have the police apparatus that we have in France. They have police forces, but they're far less centralized. They have police forces with anti-emote equipment, but they don't have the equivalent on a national scale of the bodies we have. The Republican security companies for the police, the mobile gendarmerie, in other words, police forces that are capable, if need be, of imposing order by force. And that's extremely important, because if you have a power that isn't capable of imposing order by force, the day that order risks toppling over completely, its only solution is to find new compromises and possibly lean on one faction rather than another. And that, I think, plays a huge part in the way things come together in the UK, quite simply because basically the British powers that be figure that the little white guys who are demonstrating, even if some of them are undoubtedly bullies, people who come from hooligan backgrounds, people who are prone to violence, there's no mistaking it. We've seen images of looting in particular, where it was British people who went to loot stores, just as we saw people who, it turns out, were essentially of immigrant origin, looting last year in June. So there were times when things really turned into riots and outright looting in several places, which were not really politically motivated and could hardly be linked to the murder of the 3 girls. In such cases, the authorities are obliged to retaliate. But when there's a risk of communal confrontation, the authorities will naturally target the community that's easiest to silence, i.e., quite simply, the indigenous British population. This means quite simply that the native British population is the most likely to recognize that the law must remain in force and to take less of a stand against the demonstrators. And in fact, polls have been published by YouGov, the results of which may seem a little curious and which show that the British population polled is sympathetic to the peaceful demonstrations that followed the murder of the 3 little girls. On the other hand, extremely few support the violent part of it, i.e., people do want demonstrations, but not violent ones, even to defend a cause that seems just. And also, and above all, as soon as the protests are a little virulent, it seems, even without descending into violence, there's opposition, probably because of a risk, a fear of chaos or something like that. So for the authorities, it's very clear that that's where they have to strike, because it'll calm everyone down. So that's the first problem, if you like, which is that I think we're more or less, we've got other problems in France, but we're pretty safe from this kind of combination, because images, as we've seen with British police officers coming in, British chiefs of police and officials who start their speeches by saying Salam alaikum, and with bearded men in the background, that's, I think we can say, something you'll never see in the French Republic, both for a question of secularity and also quite simply because a prefect doesn't need to submit to that sort of thing. The prefect has the full force of the state behind him, and we can send him companies of mobile gendarmes and companies of CRS, and we've seen that the police here haven't been pushed around as much as the British police, as we've seen over the last few days. For better or for worse, this has cost the Gilets jaunes dearly, in a rather scandalous way, and it has to be said, moreover, I was moved by it, like a certain number of people saying that there had been police violence, notably then at the time of the demonstrations on pensions, which were inadmissible. We've also got the Bravem and all that, so it's another notch above. It's practically like the Iranian Basijis at that level of violence, guys coming to bludgeon on motorcycles. That a fortiori you don't find with the British. But all the same, when it comes to managing a crisis like that, it's much easier to stay in power. It's a lot easier to remain a referee when you've got strength on your side than when you don't. And so that's a problem, and that's already a structural problem with British power. And so the only way to do this is to more or less choose a side and launch into a narrative that will try to impose a certain vision of things. And the British narrative, as we all know, is the idea that the people demonstrating are manipulated and are all extreme right-wingers, which is false, because in particular, when you look at fact-checking, you get the feeling that it's become, and this is also trans-Western, we'll say it's transversal to the West. There are these fact-checkers who have in fact become factories for manufacturing narratives that serve power by taking the facts and imposing the fact-checker's interpretation, the interpretation of the facts as fact, which is not the same thing. And in this case, for example, as I said earlier, there was misinformation circulating about the murder of the 3 little girls, because the guy wasn't a migrant, he was the son of an immigrant, and he wasn't a Muslim, because it seems that as a Rwandan he must be Catholic. So I saw rumors that he had converted to Islam, but it doesn't seem to have been confirmed since. But the thing is, from the moment you have the media explaining to you that people who are demonstrating are doing so because they've been misinformed, you're assuming that these people wouldn't have demonstrated against mass immigration. If they'd known that the murderer was a second-generation immigrant and not a first-generation one, and that he was a Christian and not a Muslim. Now, when people have a problem with mass immigration, you can imagine that their problem is that they make a link between immigration and delinquency, or even crime in this case. The problem isn't so much that the guy just got off the boat, that's incidental, and it's fairly typical of this fake fact-checking, which is a real disinformation factory. In fact, counter-disinformation, which is to twist the facts. You take 10% falsehoods in a fact. You explain that people believed completely anything, when basically they were right. Simply it's on a detail that is wrong. And that's extremely serious because, and here I'm coming back to what I was saying at the beginning, you're coming back to what we see at the same time. It should be painful, but few people seem to notice. You're falling with Great Britain in what we see at the same time. On what we're seeing in Great Britain, and you realize that you're seeing the same thing in Venezuela with Maduro's disputed election. In other words, those who are protesting are factious, they're far right, they're fascists. Elon Musk is a fascist, people are being misinformed by Elon Musk via social networks and so on. In other words, we end up with a British government that sounds like a communist dictator. In fact, that's what you have to say. That sounds like a communist dictator for silence the people, so that perhaps the rioters and demonstrators in Great Britain don't have as much support as Maduro's opponents. That can always be debated in the figures. But the fact is that when you have a method that is identical, it becomes extremely worrying about the level of democracy you're at. And that's where the problem of British democracy comes in. You have to realize that Keir Starmer, who was elected last month and whose media explained to you that he had won an historic victory, because in fact, I haven't checked this figure exactly, But he won an absolutely record number of seats in the House of Commons with this election, while the Conservatives were completely wiped out. So 400 seats, which really is a record, except that it obtained this number of seats with a score in terms of number of votes lower than Jeremy Corbyn's 5 years ago, which was a historic defeat for the Labour Party since it had never had so few seats, I think, for 20 years before. What does this mean? It means that Keir Starmer won a so-called historic victory with a crushing majority in the House of Commons. Commons with a lower score than what was a historic defeat 5 years ago. This is absolutely unprecedented. And there are other things that are unprecedented. You look at the percentage of the vote that Keir Starmer got by half. Never before has there been such a low percentage of votes won by the Labour Party and by the party that wins elections, especially since the defeat of Tony Blair, who had half the vote. Of the vote. But traditionally, it's relatively rare in Great Britain for the winner of an election to have less than 40% of the vote. It happens less than a third of the time, in fact. And with scores this low, you have to remember that before Tony Blair's 35% score at 2005, you had to go back to 1974 to get 37%. And the time before that, when there was already 37%, it was 1929. And there was a big difference at the time. In 1929, as in 1974, participation was between 76 and 78%. In other words, you had a lower percentage, but you had more votes. In 1974, with 37%, you had over 11 million votes, almost 12 million votes. But now, with Keir Starmer, we find ourselves at a very, very low level, because at the same time, they have 33% of the vote, but with only 60% participation. You have to know, I've retyped all the election results since at least 1918. It's important because 1918 was the introduction of universal male suffrage. It was very late in England, and partially female too at the time, so there weren't even all women yet. And in fact, throughout the 20th century, right up to the turn of the millennium, that's when turnout began to plummet. Elections were always over 75% turnout, the British general election. That collapsed. We fell to around 60%, and now we've been at 60% for the last 20 years or so in British elections. This means that in absolute terms, Keir Starmer is part of the British electorate, but is in fact a minority, and clearly a minority. The problem is that the British suffrage system is first past the post. In other words, to win the election, all you have to do is come out on top in the first round. In other words, if you get 30% in the first round and everyone else gets less than 30%, your candidate is elected, period. Is that clear? So that's what makes it possible for the country as a whole to have this overwhelming result. With a voting system that's very, very low, and that's very problematic because this voting system is not at all democratic. First past the post. It's an old voting system that's very clear. But on that very point, I tend to say that the United Kingdom is a victim of a kind of health dependency. You know, a health dependency is when you launch yourself into a technology. For example, you're the first to adopt that technology, but that means you're going to build a whole network based on that technology. And when the next more advanced technology appears, those who lag behind you will install the network based on the most advanced technology. And so you'll find yourself behind everyone else, even though you were there first. That's how dependency health works. In this case, I think there's a democratic health of dependency for the UK. The fact that they were the first major functional democracy in Europe was an advantage for a long time, but for a while now it's been a big disadvantage because they find themselves in a situation that's relatively less democratic because they're attached to systems that were way ahead of their time when they were set up, but to which they've remained attached, whereas in Europe we've done better. And what is better? Proportional representation. Proportional representation is the dominant voting system in Europe. There are two major exceptions to this system, the United Kingdom and France. You already know what I think of France in terms of democratic functioning. The British have an advantage over us in that their system is normally parliamentary, but their parliamentary system is in fact sabotaged by this voting system. Why is this? Because in the parliamentary system, given the results of the election, you should have about a quarter of the seats that should have gone to the Conservative Party. Kirsten Ammer's Labour Party should have had 33% of the seats, and then after that there would have been 12% of the Liberal Democrat seats. Nigel Farage would have had 14%, and the Greens would have had 6%. But as you can see, that's not at all the same thing as having a two-thirds majority, a majority in the Assembly. And you can see that the voting system has distorted British democracy even more than it has here. In our case, despite everything, even with the two-round first-past-the-post system, it's still better than that, to say the least. And so we can say that the United Kingdom has the least democratic electoral system in Europe, and that it is in fact totally sabotaging its democracy, because, as I said, voter turnout is plummeting. And we end up with a Kirsten Ammer who is elected with 33% of the vote, and that's interesting. It's interesting because it means you've got Kirsten Ammer. Because of the voting system, he's elected with about a third of the vote, and he has an absolute majority. In other words, he wins all the power, basically, in the British authorities, and this is exactly what is likely to have happened in Venezuela. In other words, Maduro, it seems, according to the figures we have, would have had 31 or 32% of the vote. Urrutia, the opposition candidate from the opposition coalition, would have had 65% of the vote, and yet in the end it's Maduro who says he's elected, who wins and who has all the power. Well, the fact is that in practice, and we have to recognize this and we have to say it, you have a Kirsten Ammer today who is elected in the same way as Maduro. So, of course, countries' political systems are not the same. There are supposed to be safeguards in Great Britain. But as I've already told you many times, there's a wisdom of people. There's an intelligence of people. It's the wisdom of crowds, if you like. And people feel it when they get robbed of an election, and it pisses them off. We used to have yellow vests, and now we have riots in the United Kingdom, because the people who are very hostile to immigration probably wouldn't have won the election on their own. The UK reformers, for example, behind Nadia El Farage, but in a system of proportional representation, he should have had much more weight than he has here, and he doesn't have it. And so we end up with a democracy that is extremely dysfunctional in Great Britain. And when you have a power that is in a minority like that, in spite of everything, it's necessary to resort to this kind of means of truncated narratives, media bludgeoning, demonization of the opposition to maintain itself. Because it's logical, you're in the minority, you can't do otherwise. And so for me, what's very worrying in Great Britain is that Keir Starmer is in that position and behaving in that way. And what tends to worry me perhaps even more is that in Europe, okay, the United Kingdom is out with the Brexit, but in Europe we're supporting it when we should be criticizing the democratic state in which it's embracing itself. So we're giving it support. I haven't looked at everyone. I know that Emmanuel Macron is giving support, and that considering that we're also a problematic regime, it's not so surprising that we went to support him. But if you like, for me, it's very important because it means that you have a United Kingdom that is a very sick democracy. And the way it works at the moment, I'm not sure that the country is considering a reform of the voting system. And that's very worrying because it's likely to lead the country into ever more internal political violence. I fear that very much. So there you have it, if you like, for a simple analysis based on the data we have on the country and this little history of democracy. Now, I'd like to move on to the Historinomic comparison. That is to see what Great Britain tells us about the evolution of the West in general. Is it still at the forefront of this evolution? In other words, is it showing us our destiny? Or is it something different? Is it a special case? Can it happen differently elsewhere? Because sometimes the fact of being the one in the lead also gives a counterexample to the others, who then have time to react. Britain, as I was saying, within the European world, it's the country that came out on top. It was the first country in the 17th century, the country of standard size, so to speak, i.e. the large countries that were and remained large nations on a European scale, and even on a global scale, was the first country to undergo a national revolution in the 17th century and to become a parliamentary system and thus gradually become a parliamentary democracy. Because at first, the parliamentary system is not a democracy, it's rather oligarchic, and it becomes more democratic over time with the extension of the electorate. As I said, in Great Britain, the extension of the electorate came very late, since universal suffrage was only introduced in 1918. In other words, they were 70 years behind us, since the definitive introduction of universal male suffrage, in France at any rate, was in 1989. They were a little ahead of us on women's suffrage, on the other hand, since we whipped in 2944 and it began in 19128. But from the age of 30, it seems to me, meaning that there was still discrimination against men, since men could vote from the age of 21 and women had to wait until they were 30. In short, all that, which may mean that they're also behind on the adoption of proportional representation and that they're going to move towards it. In any case, it could be a debate, and it'll be interesting to see if it's a debate that puts the question of proportional representation in Great Britain to overcome this kind of crisis and problem of legitimacy, as in Kirchthorne. Even if it doesn't seem to me that it's a subject that's been much talked about. Democratic illegitimacy, because everyone's sticking to the institutions. The people have voted. The voting system's just the way it is, as if we shouldn't be asking questions about voting methods, which is really rather bizarre. So anyway, so I was saying England. I'm talking about England, United Kingdom, but it's mainly England, the first parliamentary then democratic regime in the modern world, in European civilization. Also, the colonial power, since, as you know, in historionomic models, within what we call Civilization A, ancient Greece, modern Europe, Civilization A is the one that contains the country which is the first in its civilizational cycle to reach this stage of parliamentary democracy. Because when it reaches this stage of parliamentary democracy, it also becomes a merchant imperialist power, and therefore a major colonial power. And so it was with the British Empire. For the Greeks, it happened in a slightly different way. I won't go into the details, you know I won't. Just remember that it was via the Macedonian conquest with Alexander the Great and all that, that the equivalent of the British Empire came about. And that is the conquest of the entire Orient. The Orient at the time was the Persian Empire and Egypt in ancient times. In modern times, it was the entire non-European Persia, Egypt, but also India, of course, and partially China, even if it wasn't dominated in the same way. But it was nonetheless beaten and subjected to a number of unequal treaties during the 19th century. And one small difference between the ancient world and the modern world is that the Greeks moved around a great deal, i.e., there wasn't really any immigration from the east to Europe. Immigration to Greece from the east, in ancient times it was rather the Greeks who went to settle in the equivalent of their colony, if you like. So Greece became depopulated, and the major Greek centers of influence in the Hellenistic period, i.e. the period after Alexander the Great, i.e. after 383 BC. In the Hellenistic period, the major Greek centers were in the Near East, in particular Alexandria, of course, in Egypt, but also Antioch and a number of eastern cities, which were the great cities of the East, and which were essentially, or at least very largely, populated by Greeks, the Greeks who ruled there. So that's the big difference, if you like. In ancient times, the Greeks went to that world, but in modern times, the British colonized very little. There were a few hundred or thousand British in India. In India, the British never settled down to found major British cities in India. They ruled the Indians very clearly, but in reality, the number of British who were there was very small. The Greeks did something quite different, but in the end, and this is my point, in the end, the result was that the two populations were mixed. For the Greeks, It was because they went to settle en masse in Egypt, for example, and thus in Alexandria. And so they rubbed shoulders with the Egyptians around them, who were their colonial population. The British, for their part, imported into Great Britain very large populations, mainly from the former British Raj, i.e. India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, back home in the UK. So if you want to have a historionomic model of what British society is today, i.e. in parallel in antiquity, that is in the British Isles, we must examine how Hellenistic Greek societies were in the Middle East at that time. Describing Greek life in Alexandria. Greeks in Alexandria. And the fact is, life in Alexandria didn't end well for the Greeks. There were indeed ethnic conflicts, but there were also enormous conflicts with the Jews. And when I say the Jews, you have to realize that it was the Jews of antiquity. In other words, the Jews of antiquity were the structural equivalent of what Muslims are in our modern world, i.e. A population with a very demanding religion that was culturally very much at odds with European culture today and Greek culture at the time. There have been extremely strong struggles in this area, and a number of wars in particular, including the Kitos War, which I talk about regularly. I'm not going to go into detail about it again tonight. I may do a future program on it. I had hesitated to make it tonight's topic, but I preferred to start by dealing with the United Kingdom. And that actually ended with the departure of the Greeks from Alexandria, who had to flee and join the Byzantine Empire, which was in the 5th century or so, under construction, and so they returned to Greece. And that's one possibility in the evolution of the United Kingdom, which I think we need to realize today, is that if there's never a reversal, particularly on the question of migration, if there's never a reversal, it is likely, as you know, I often say, that in my opinion, in a few decades or in the next century, Europe will become in the post-American world the equivalent of what the Byzantine Empire was in antiquity. It's not at all impossible that the native British populations leave Britain to take refuge on the continent, and that Great Britain itself, the British Isles, would be lost to populations imported from the British Kingdom. It's not at all impossible, but you have to realize that while cinema often, tells the story, and it's the English themselves who tell it in their scripts, because often it's English films basically telling post-apocalyptic stories where most of the world has collapsed, but England, being an island, has managed to hold on. That's what you have in Sons of Man, for example, which is an extraordinary scene. And some of the scenes we've seen in the last few days are still fresh in our memory, and it's also the case in V for Vendetta, for example, to give just 2 examples. But the reality is that it's rather, in the story, it's rather the British population that has tended either to submit to foreign invaders or to simply get the hell out of the way of these foreign invaders. We mustn't forget that if we have Brittany in France, which wasn't originally Brittany but was Armorica, it's because the Bretons from the Isle of Brittany came and reminded Brittany of the place they had come to, because it was now populated by Bretons, because they had fled from the English Saxon invaders who had invaded what is now English territory, if you like. You have to remember that. So it's not at all impossible. In fact, it would be an ethno-geographical repetition that there was an escape, that the British population would eventually flee their own island. I don't know if they'll come to Brittany, but to join a kind of Byzantine Empire in Europe. That's something. If we stay on this trajectory in which there's no reversal, and where the elites continue to take the side of immigrant populations against the rebellions of the native-born population, that's where we're heading, because it means that you're going to have a continuation of this mass immigration, and that the native birth rate will mean that the population differential will be greater and greater. More immigration leads to loss of native-born, resulting in an unfortunate outcome. On a more general note, for the time being, this would be a scenario, as I've just said, which would still be British, i.e. it wouldn't apply to the West in general, for the time being, as I was saying, since it would mean that Europe, in any case, would have become a kind of refuge for this population, the roughly indigenous white British population. There's something else that needs to be seen more generally in the West this time, and that's the hypothesis that England is our destiny, showing us what's in store for us, or what's likely to be in store for the West as a whole. We have to realize that while having been the first democracy in the Western world, the United Kingdom is also the first country in Europe to have reached an advanced stage of decomposition, civilizational decomposition, corresponding also to what we see in the Roman Empire, if you like, the phenomenon of barbarization. How did this happen? Import populations from non-traditional areas, outside traditional civilization, and increasingly so, as the local population has become extremely tame, no longer so keen to fight, join the army, etc., it's becoming a population that enjoys itself more, also a population that has fewer children, etc., which we can say is the case from the boomer generation onwards. From that point on, you have a tendency for native populations, at the same time as they lose interest in the military, in strength, in combat, to lose interest in or access to political leadership positions, quite simply because they're not interested. Political leadership functions, quite simply. And so you see a gradual replacement in political functions of populations that used to be of native origin by populations of immigrant origin. And the fact is, in the British Isles, where you've had a large proportion of the UK's, a good part of the UK's ruling elites who come from the former British Raj, you've had Rishi Sunak in Keir Starmer. We're back to a native guy, but, well, Rishi Sunak, you've had the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, you've had the Irish First Minister, you've had the Scottish First Minister, who today, by the way, is making videos explaining that he's considering leaving the country because there are too many extreme right-wingers. So you have to realize that this phenomenon, which we've also seen in the history of the Roman Empire, for example, but which Yves Khaldun explains very well in general terms, and which we've seen in many places in the Chinese empires, etc., where we tend to see barbarians from the frontiers who come to exercise the functions of power in the country more and more over the long term. Well, we can see that this is something that's happening in England, which is the most advanced place in England, very clearly. There's no other country in Europe where a large proportion of the political class has been replaced by people of immigrant origin. I'm telling you, for a year or two, just a year ago, you had most of the highest positions of power in the British Isles held by people who came from the British Reich, be it Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. So in that sense, it means that England is following a logic that affected the Romans and Greeks in antiquity. And so we can say, since the modern West as a whole is the equivalent of what it was in antiquity, if England is the cutting edge of that, then it's likely to wait for a good part of us too. So, if you take the Byzantine Empire, what characterized it was that it remained essentially Greek. It didn't put Gauls, Visigoths, or Vandals in the position of generals on its side. Rather, it was on the side of the Western Empire. And on that side, we might wonder whether the United Kingdom, which has always tended towards the open sea, as Churchill used to say, doesn't belong more to the American Empire of the West than to the American Empire of the East, which would be continental Europe in a way. In other words, an area that is more likely to sink, precisely because its elites will be replaced ethnically by elites from its former colonial area. I tend to have trouble seeing England as once again just our destiny for the whole of Europe, because it's such a caricatured example and at the same time so advanced. Clearly, if you compare with what's going on in Germany, France, or elsewhere, in France or elsewhere, you have MPs of immigrant origin everywhere in the parliaments, but you don't have this level of elite replacement. And in my opinion, it would take a long time for that to happen, and I'm not sure that it will. Is there not some kind of British counterexample that could finally give rise to some kind of reaction to this in continental Europe? In my opinion, that's where we're heading. But in England, on the other hand, I think that this situation is more likely to fester. That's why I'm sticking to the Alexandrian scenario. Because you have to realize that in this very Roman Empire, you had from a certain point on the same collusion between barbarians, that is, immigrants from the Roman Empire, people from the barbarian world within the Roman Empire, between the barbarians and the classical Roman elites. There's a well-known case of Thessalonica in the years around 380 AD under the Emperor Theodosius, during which the emperor's troops, who were immigrant troops, in fact tribesmen who were entrusted with military functions, but also took on policing duties. The Go, therefore, were used to put down a tax revolt by the native Greek population of the Greek city of Thessalonica. And the Go slaughtered around 7,000 Thessalonians, who had had the nerve to revolt against the empire because they didn't want to pay taxes anymore. They were fed up with seeing Go, in fact, quite simply. And in this case, the emperor had taken the side, the imperial structure in any case. It's hard to know if Theodosius was exactly aware of this. The imperial power structure had taken the side of the Go against the Greco-Roman population, who had repressed themselves simply because strength was notably on the side of the Go. And it was simply more profitable for the power logic of the imperial structure itself to use the force of the Go to make the taxpayers pay, rather than please the taxpayers by kicking out the Goks, because yes, it doesn't work. And so we reach a point, and the imperial logic, once again, it's Khaldun. The imperial logic of power is that the population of taxpayers must be kept in check, that they must be sheep that you can shear to finance the imperial state and its stability, and that it will be able to pay people, mercenaries in particular, to maintain security. So that's the difference with the national state, if you like. In a national structure, the interest of the government is to serve its own population and the interests of its own population. When you come to an imperial structure, you have a disjunction of the local and its indigenous elites. And in an imperial regime, you have a tendency for native elites to rely on non-native populations to guarantee their own privileges and power against the indigenous population. This doesn't happen in a national regime, but it does in an imperial one. So the fact of having a population that is once again highly heterogeneous due to the arrival of a massive influx of populations from outside recreates the conditions of an imperial state. And there's another interesting thing. On another scale, it's also, if you like, the way imperial power is always structured. Imperial power is always more or less a national power, i.e., it's a community with relatively close ties, which, thanks to the competitive advantage it enjoys, can impose itself on a whole host of other territories. And once this close-knit, tribal, culturally close-knit group has imposed itself on all the other territories, a power issue emerges within this initial core that has imposed itself on everyone else, and is beginning to use territories that have been acquired precisely to gain more power within it. I'll give you an example because it may seem a little abstract like that. I'll take the French monarchy. What is it? It's essentially a system of feudal power of the Frankish nobility, who essentially lived in the north of France. This area is north of the Loire. Old France, that's it. This is the area that had been invaded by the Franks and where the Franks had a significant presence, which was not the case south of the Loire. Right. The conquest of all French territory took place under feudal rule between Philippe Auguste and Saint Louis, which ended with Saint Louis' crusade against the Albigensians, who came to conquer my hometown of Toulouse, by the northern Frankish nobility, Simon de Montfort, etc. Let me remind you that Simon de Montfort is remembered in Toulouse because next to the Jardin des Plantes, there's still a commemorative plaque on the spot where Simon de Montfort was hit in the face with a catapult stone. That explains why his head exploded under the thing. And it's something we're very proud of because he was the guy who came to conquer Toulouse. And he took one. So it's a memory that's still with us. Anyway, we were conquered in the 13th century by Frankish nobility, who still came from the north at that time. And from the moment it was done, it was still the feudal monarchy of the good King Saint Louis. And from the following kings onwards, you have the French monarchy, in other words, the Frankish monarchy, which relied on its barons, and in whose order the king remained the first among the great feudal lords, and which relied on the nobility that came from outside this place, from this northern France, to put them in competition with his own nobility around him, to enable the king to rise higher and have more power than his nobility, and in fact get rid of his nobility, if you will, if you like. And that's how, during the 100 Years' War, you have the famous conflict between the Burgundians and the Armagnacs around the King of France. And the King of France relied mainly on the Armagnacs against the Burgundians. Why did he do this? Because the Burgundians were the traditional Frankish nobility around the King of France, trying to maintain their status, whereas the Armagnacs were those who wanted to climb the French ladder of power, and so played a win-win role with the king. It was the king, I'll take you up, and you'll take me up even higher than my nobility, right? And in fact, in post-colonial states like France, but especially like the UK, you find the same pattern. That is, you have national powers after their parliamentary revolution become colonial powers. Colonial powers within which you had, let's say, the imperial caste or class, that was the British population itself. And with the constitution of the British Empire in the first instance, and then the importation of immigration from the British Empire, you have British elites seeking to statutorily detach themselves from the British population in order to ensure their caste distance, their power, etc., with a social mobility that is less and less great, and so on. And that ties in with what I was saying about the weakening of democracy, etc., as well. In other words, this dynamic, people-elite dynamic, and the elite's use of the periphery against their own people to keep themselves in power is an affliction that clearly affects the UK and much, much more than any other country in Europe. We're really on a different level, in my opinion, from what we find even in France, in our own state. So, from that point of view, I think that both Great Britain, the UK, indicates the destiny of what the West would be if we were to continue in that line. But at the same time, I don't think that's going to be the case. And I'd like to thank Thomas for sharing this very interesting article on the subject, which suggests that the rest of Europe will not be affected by the same thing. And that example is Sweden. Sweden. 3 days ago, on August 8th, Actu Orange published an article indicating that for the first time in 50 years, Sweden will have a negative net migration this year. In other words, with more people leaving than coming. So naturally, the question we asked ourselves when we saw these figures was, yes, but doesn't this mean that Sweden is exporting BRC plus 7 and importing BRC minus 7, and that it is in fact exporting far more BAC plus 7 than it is importing BAC minus 7? In other words, it's not just that non-European immigration to Sweden has fallen, but that immigration has risen sharply. Well, it seems not. In fact, it seems that immigration has fallen sharply. But that, in addition, migration from countries like Iraq, Somalia, and Syria, in other words, many of the people who arrived during the migration crisis of 2015 are leaving again, So where are they going? Are they going to England or elsewhere? I don't know. Where are they going back home? I don't know. But it seems that Sweden is entering a new model after correcting its immigration problems, a bit like Denmark has done too, in which the locals leave perhaps a little less, and where the people who used to come, the non-European immigrants, are leaving. So either they're going elsewhere in Europe or the West, or they're going back home. I don't know about that, but in any case, they're leaving. And so, if you like, that is a clue. So it's affecting Sweden. It's also affecting... It is the Scandinavian countries, Denmark specifically, where left-leaning socio-democrats have made sacrifices out of fear of far-right ascendancy. This decision is to prevent the rise of far-right forces. They made some sacrifices, maybe different from France, like the possibility they have. They don't have the same economic infrastructure as we do. We have this famous consumer immigrationism that I've often talked about, which doesn't exist historically in these Scandinavian countries, so it's enabled them to make the switch more quickly. But it's not impossible that here in continental Europe, with the rise in power of Eastern Europeans, who are much more hostile to immigration, with a certain number of things likely to happen here in France. You've already seen the British example, which I think is going to frighten a lot of people, particularly the French elite, as they realize that the bands of armies we've seen creating the Wagbar, etc., are still a bit scary. There may also be other effects, perhaps more anecdotal, but it'll be interesting to see what happens over the course of the year, and particularly as soon as the new school year starts. In other words, this enchanted parenthesis of the Olympic Games, where in the end it's almost an extreme right-wing program that's been applied to Paris, since the poor and immigrants have been deported elsewhere in the country to keep Paris clean. When all these people come back the day after the Olympics, it's not impossible that it'll create a kind of electroshock, at least in part of the Parisian elite, and that it'll help bring about this mutation that hasn't taken place so far in our country, but that we've been hearing about for the last few months or years, with this idea, particularly since last year with the riots, saying, look at what the Scandinavians have done, they're not extreme right-wingers, and so on. So I think this Swedish example confirms the idea that on a continental European scale, I don't think what's happening in the UK is our destiny. I think we're going to end up with a model that's pretty close to the ancient model. In other words, a model in which the future will be rather Byzantine in Europe, i.e. even with a relative worldwide decline, civilization will outlive other places, ensuring its longer existence through a kind of reaffirmation. Let's say identity or ethno-cultural reaffirmation linked in particular to the fact that this is the first area to be confronted with the problems of mass immigration, so we can react before it's too late. And it's likely that continental Europe will, in the next 20 or 30 years, do the same thing as the Byzantines did, i.e., when the Byzantines saw the Go or other barbarians arriving from the north and in danger of flooding into the settlement, they gave them money and told them to go west instead. And so, in fact, they sent all these people to Italy, Gaul, etc., and that's how the Visigoths ended up in Italy and Gaul. Ended up in Italy and Spain, even though they'd arrived in the Balkans. So I see something more like that on a European scale. Now, the future of the United Kingdom itself, I'm not sure. That it's an astonishment that we'll manage to survive the current crisis. I think that the next few years are going to be very, very important because it's a country that's effectively on borrowed time, meaning that the window of opportunity to react, I think, is likely to close pretty quickly, and if it doesn't, the risk of civil war in the long term is very real, especially if there's no effort to reform the electoral system.